There's a special kind of fear that doesn't come from predators, storms, or hunger. It comes from evidence, proof that someone was here. And then the proof stops. We were 3 days into a barren stretch of land so empty it felt unfinished, like the world had forgotten to paint it in. No villages, no roads, no phone signal, just wind scraping over stone and a horizon that never got closer. That morning, we found the first print by accident, a perfect human footprint pressed into pale dust beside a dry creek bed. At first, it was almost comforting. Human means help. Human means a story with an ending. But the footprint wasn't old. The edges were crisp, like it had been made within hours, and it wasn't alone. Another print followed it, then another. A trail, steady, deliberate, leading straight into the open nothingness. We followed, because that's what explorers do when the wilderness offers a clue. We measured stride length, we noted the direction, we photographed every detail, and the deeper we went, the stranger it became. The prints never wandered, never hesitated, no drag marks, no signs of stumbling. Just a clean, calm march across a landscape that punishes every step. Then we saw something that made my mouth go dry. The footprints weren't sinking the way they should. They were too clean, too exact, like someone had stamped them there. And then, without warning, the trail ended, not faded, not covered by wind, not interrupted by rock. One final footprint, and beyond it, nothing at all. As if the person had taken one last step and simply stopped existing. The story you just heard is a fictional narrative created for entertainment. My name is Ethan Rourke, and I've spent most of my life chasing unanswered questions into places most people would never willingly enter. Deserts, glaciers, high ridgelines, anywhere the map turns vague and the air feels untouched. But I've never forgotten the day we followed human footprints into nowhere and watched them vanish like a lie. We were running a small, privately funded survey, just enough backing to rent satellite gear, pack water caches, and hire a local tracker named Evo, a man who could read ground the way others read books. With me was Marla Caine, our field photographer, sharp-eyed and steady under pressure. The plan was simple. Document an unstudied corridor of terrain where old reports mentioned unnatural silence and sudden weather shifts. I didn't believe the folklore. I believed in geology, patterns, and hard data. That belief started to crack the moment Evo crouched beside the first footprint and didn't speak for a full 10 seconds. He just stared, then looked up at me with a face I'd never seen on him before, something between confusion and offense, like the land itself had insulted him. We marked the coordinates. We checked wind direction. We argued possibilities, another expedition, an injured hiker, a prank. Yet nothing about those prints fit the logic of a real person walking across that ground. Still, we followed, because leaving a mystery untouched is its own kind of surrender. Before we go further, take a second and subscribe to the channel. These stories only keep coming if you're here for them. Like the video if you want more survival mysteries, and comment where in the world you're watching from, because I read those comments. And sometimes they change what story I tell next. Now listen closely, because the moment those footprints disappeared was only the beginning. By the third day, the landscape stopped feeling like a place and started feeling like a condition. A flat, bruised horizon, bone-dry channels that pretended to be rivers, wind that never fully rested, scraping across stone and hardpan as if the desert were trying to erase itself, one grain at a time. We moved early before the heat rose and the light turned sharp enough to hurt your eyes. Evo walked ahead, quiet, his shoulders slightly hunched against the wind. He was the kind of tracker who didn't waste words on maybes. When he did speak, you listened, because it meant the ground had said something. Marla kept pace beside me, camera rig hugged to her chest like a child. She didn't complain, not once, but I could tell she was fighting the same thing I was. How the emptiness presses on the mind. In civilization, silence is a choice. Out here, silence is the default, and you're the intrusion. We were cutting along a dry creek bed, hoping the shallow channel would give us firmer footing and some protection from the gusts. The dust in the bottom was pale, almost chalky, and it held marks the way fresh snow holds secrets. Every animal that crossed it left a signature, the sharp two-toe stamp of antelope, the delicate dots of a lizard's run, the meandering line of a snake. That was why Ivo stopped so suddenly that I nearly collided with him. He crouched low and held up a hand, palm down. A quiet command. Marla froze. I stepped around, careful not to kick the dust. At first I didn't see it. The print was too ordinary for the mind to register as a threat. Heel, arch, ball, toes, a perfect human footprint pressed into the powder as if someone had stepped there barefoot. Barefoot. Out here, where the ground could slice skin like glass and the temperatures swung from scorching midday to near-freezing night, barefoot wasn't reckless. It was insane. Ivo stared at it without blinking. When he finally looked at me, there was no excitement in his eyes, only offense, like the desert had broken a rule. "Fresh," he said, voice low. He pinched a bit of dust from the edge of the impression and let it fall back in. Hours, maybe less. I knelt and studied it the way I'd studied hundreds of other clues in other places. The edges were crisp, no wind softening, no collapse. The print was deep enough to be clear, but not deep enough for a real foot with real weight on this surface. Marla lowered her camera and whispered, "Could be a worker, someone from a camp." "There are no camps for 40 miles, I said. Even saying it felt ridiculous. 40 miles might as well have been the moon. Ivo shifted his gaze past the print, scanning the creek bed ahead. Then he pointed. Another footprint. The same size, the same clean outline, facing the same direction, and another beyond it. A straight line of human steps leading away from us into the creek bed's gentle curve. My first thought was exactly what I didn't want it to be. Someone in trouble, injured, disoriented, heat-struck. The mind clings to the simplest story it can survive. We did what professionals do. We marked coordinates. We photographed. We measured the stride. We checked for accompanying signs, scuff marks, heel drag, places where a foot slipped on gravel. But the trail was too tidy. Each step landed as if placed with care. No hesitation, no stumble, no change in pace. Ivo walked the edges of the creek bed and shook his head. "One set," he said. "No return." Marla swallowed. "So, someone walked out here alone and barefoot?" I stared down the line of prints and felt that cold little click inside my chest, the moment when curiosity stops being playful and becomes an obligation. I didn't want to follow, not really, but turning away felt like abandoning a living person to an indifferent place. "We follow," I said. We moved slowly, stepping to the sides of the trail so we wouldn't contaminate it. The creek bed narrowed and widened, twisting around clusters of rock. The prints stayed centered, always in the softest dust, as if whoever made them knew exactly where the ground would hold their mark. After 20 minutes, Marla quietly said, "Ethan, do you see that?" I looked closer and felt my stomach tighten. In several prints, the toe marks were too sharp, too defined. Real toes blur at the edges because skin compresses, shifts. These looked like impressions made by something rigid. Ivo stopped again, touching the dust beside a print with the tip of his finger. "Foot does not sink like this," he murmured. "Dust is soft. It should press down more." I didn't answer. I was calculating. Body weight, surface density, wind exposure, anything that could keep the world sensible. The sun climbed higher, washing the creek bed in hard light. Heat shimmer rose from the rocks. Our water packs were heavy, and the salt on my lips tasted like old coins. Every 10 minutes we paused, checked the map, took a compass bearing. The footprints never deviated. They led us forward like a ruler line drawn across a page. And then, as if the desert were listening to our thoughts and decided to prove a point, the creek bed ended. Not in a river, not in an oasis, not even in a canyon. It simply spilled into open plain, hard, flat ground, speckled with brittle scrub and scattered stones. The kind of terrain where tracks should vanish quickly if they appear at all. But the prints continued. They crossed the plain in the same straight progression, each step showing up in small patches of dust that collected between rocks. It was like following a sentence written in punctuation marks. Here, a footprint. There, another. Always forward, always sure. Marla kept filming, her face tight with concentration. Ivo's eyes never left the ground. He moved like a man trying to read a language that was almost familiar, but just wrong enough to insult him. We followed for another hour. The wind picked up, coming in sharp bursts that stung our eyes. The plain offered no shade. My shirt clung to my back with sweat that dried too quickly, turning into salt. The world became a narrow tunnel. Footprint, step, footprint, step. I was so locked into the rhythm that I almost missed the change. The prints began to look lighter. Not faded by wind, but shallower, as if the maker had lost weight or had stopped pressing down at all. Ivo noticed before I did. He stopped and pointed to the next step. "See," he said, "same shape, less pressure." Marla's voice came out thin. "How does someone get lighter?" I wanted to tell her they didn't, that it was just ground variation, dust thickness, but the plain was consistent. The shallowness was in the prints themselves. We kept going anyway, because stopping didn't make the truth go away. Another half hour passed. The prints stayed shallow, almost kisses on the dust. Then they did something that made my throat close. They changed, not size, not direction. The shape stayed human, but the proportions shifted subtly. Longer heel, sharper arch, toes too evenly spaced. Like a perfect imitation made by someone who had only seen a human foot in a picture. "Ethan," Marla said, barely louder than the wind, "this doesn't look like skin." I crouched, bringing my face close. The edges were clean enough to cut. A real foot leaves tiny imperfections, creases, uneven pressure, the slight drag of a toe. This was a stamp, a mold. I stood up too fast and the horizon tilted. For a moment I felt that primitive panic that comes from being too small in too much space. I forced my breathing to slow. "Could be a hoax," I said, though my voice didn't carry conviction. "Someone messing with us." Ivo finally looked away from the ground and scanned the empty plain around us. No movement, no dust plume, no distant figures, just endless land and a sun that didn't care. "Who makes joke here?" he asked. It wasn't a challenge, it was a genuine question, and it landed like a stone. We pushed on. At roughly what my watch told me was the 2-hour mark, Marla began to lag. Not because she was weak, because the heat was pushing all of us toward a thin edge. We took a short break beside a cluster of rocks, barely large enough to cast a shadow. I rationed water carefully, listening to the way the liquid sounded in the bottle, like something precious and finite. Marla wiped her face and looked out across the plain. "This is how people die," she said quietly. Ivo didn't respond. He was still staring at the prints, as if arguing with them silently. We continued, slower now. The footprints led us toward a low ridge of darker stone, a gentle rise that promised a wider view. The wind shifted again, carrying a faint smell I couldn't place at first. Dry, acrid, like sun-baked fabric. As we climbed the ridge, the prints became easier to follow, pressed into small drifts of dust caught behind rocks. Each one still too perfect, still too deliberate. Then we crested the top, and the ground on the other side dipped into a shallow basin. And that's where the trail ended. One last footprint sat in a patch of pale dust, perfectly formed, pointing forward. Beyond it, there was no second step, no smudge, no disturbance, not even a scuff where a foot might have pushed off. Just untouched dust and scattered stones, like the world had been reset. I walked around the last print in a widening circle, careful, scanning for any sign we'd missed. If a person had stepped onto rock, there should be a faint smear of dust, a displaced pebble, something. If the wind had erased the next steps, it would have softened this one too. But it hadn't. Marla came up beside me, her eyes wide in a way I'd never seen before. "Maybe they turned," she said, almost pleading. Ivo shook his head once. "No turn," he said. "No second set, no run, nothing." We stood there, three adults with gear and training and reason, staring at a single footprint like it was a door left open in the middle of a locked house. My mind tried to rescue me with explanations. A helicopter pickup. Impossible. No tracks, no sound, and we would have seen it. A vehicle, no tire marks. A prank. No one out here. An animal, no drag, no scuffle. A sinkhole. Hardpan. Stable. Everything I reached for snapped in my hands. Then Marla did the thing that pushed us past confusion and into something colder. She pointed to the dust just beyond the last print. "Look," she said. At first, I saw nothing. Then my eyes adjusted, and I felt the blood drain from my face. There was a second set of marks, not footprints, handprints, 5-finger impressions, pressed lightly into the dust in 2 neat lines, leading away from the last footprint for about 6 feet, like someone had been crawling. The fingers were long, too long, and the handprints ended the same way the footprints did, abruptly, cleanly, as if whoever made them had been lifted straight up. Ivo crouched and hovered his palm over one impression without touching it. His lips moved silently, like a prayer he didn't want us to hear. Marla's voice cracked. "Why would someone crawl here? Why would they crawl after walking?" I forced myself to breathe. I forced my hands to stop shaking, because now the story wasn't just that someone disappeared. It was that something happened to them right here, something that made them drop to the ground, something they tried to escape from on their hands. We followed the handprints to their end, and that's when I saw the smallest detail, the one that made every hair on my arms rise. In the dust at the final handprint, a thin line had been drawn, like a dragged fingertip, tracing a single word. It was crude, uneven, as if written by someone weak or panicking, but it was readable. "Listen." The wind shifted again, and for the first time all day, the desert seemed to hold its breath. I turned my head toward the basin, toward the emptiness beyond the ridge, and I realized the silence wasn't natural anymore. It was directed, and somewhere out there, just beyond where the tracks stopped, something made a sound that was almost a voice, but not quite, like a radio trying to tune itself to the shape of human speech. When you spend enough time in harsh places, you learn the difference between silence that belongs to nature and silence that feels arranged. The first is neutral, the second is a message. We didn't move right away. The word in the dust sat between us like a lit match. Listen, not help, not run, not even don't follow. Just listen, as if sound itself was the only warning that mattered. Marla lifted her camera, then hesitated. Her hands were trembling. She lowered it again, as if filming would make it real. Ivo's eyes stayed fixed on the handprints. "Not good," he murmured, and that was the first time he'd shown fear without trying to hide it. The basin below the ridge looked harmless from above. Scattered scrub, a gentle dip in the terrain, and a wide stretch of rock that caught sunlight like dull metal. But the longer I stared, the more I felt that sense of wrongness, as if the air over the basin had a different thickness. I crouched near the last handprint, careful not to disturb the word. My radio was clipped to my shoulder strap. I hadn't used it in hours. There was no one to call. Still, my thumb found the button and pressed it without thinking, an old habit, the human impulse to reach for a lifeline. Static answered, not the normal, indifferent hiss. This was textured, almost rhythmic, like breath through teeth. Marla's head snapped up. "Did you hear that?" I released the button. The sound stopped. I pressed again. The static returned, and beneath it something faint like a syllable trying to form. I pulled the radio off my strap and held it closer. "Base, this is Rourke," I said, even though we had no base. "If anyone's on this frequency, respond." The static swelled, then dipped, and then through the noise a voice shaped itself around my name. Then it wasn't clear, and it didn't sound like a person speaking into a mic. It sounded like a recording being played through a damaged speaker, warped, stretched, too slow. Marla's face went pale. "That's you," she whispered. "That's your name." Ivo backed away a step, scanning the basin, scanning the ridge behind us, as if expecting something to crest the horizon. I clicked the radio off. The sudden silence felt worse than the sound. "Could be interference," I said, because I needed something to hold on to. "Old equipment, atmospheric." The radio clicked on in my hand. I hadn't touched it. Static poured out, then that same warped voice, my name again, more distinct, as if it had learned. "Ethan, don't!" The message broke apart into a wet crackle, like a mouth trying to speak underwater. Marla took a step toward me and grabbed my wrist. "Turn it off," she said. "Please." I did. I flicked the switch down hard, then pulled the battery pack out as if the thing might wake up again on its own. We stood in the wind, listening now the way the dust command demanded. Nothing, no birds, no insects, no distant animal calls. Just the steady scrape of wind over stone and the faint thump of our own heartbeats. I forced myself into procedure mode. When the mind starts spiraling, you anchor it in tasks. "Okay," I said. "We document. We take photos of the prints and the writing. Then we backtrack to the creek bed and head for the nearest cache." Marla didn't argue. She only nodded, eyes glossy. Ivo didn't nod. He stared down into the basin like he was reading a sign only he could see. We began to retreat, stepping carefully, but after only a few yards, Ivo stopped. He raised his hand again. His head tilted slightly, like a dog catching a sound too high for humans. I listened hard. At first there was nothing but wind. Then, beneath it, a faint clicking, irregular and distant, like stones being tapped together. Marla whispered, "What is that?" Ivo didn't answer. He pointed toward the basin, toward a line of darker rock that cut across the depression like a scar. The clicking came again, closer, then it changed. It became almost patterned. 3 taps, a pause, 2 taps, a rhythm, a signal. My throat tightened. I had the insane thought that if I responded, something would respond back. "Don't!" Marla said under her breath, as if she'd read my mind. We kept moving, faster now, but not running. Running in open terrain is how you break an ankle, how you panic yourself into death. We reached the last footprint again, and Marla glanced down at it like it might open and swallow her. That's when she froze. Her gaze locked onto the dust beyond the print, and her face drained even more color. "Ethan," she said, voice shaking. "It's changed." I looked. The word "listen" was no longer the same. The letters had been smeared, as if a hand had brushed over them, and carved into the dust beside it, fresh, sharper, was a new word. "Stay." I felt my skin prickle. Wind could smear letters, sure, but wind didn't add new ones. Ivo crouched, his expression hard. "Not wind," he said. "Someone here." Marla's breathing turned shallow. "But we would have seen them." I looked around the basin, the ridge, the open plain. Nothing moved, no figure, no shadow. Yet the dust had been touched while we stood only yards away, listening to the clicking. A cold thought slid into place. Whatever was communicating didn't need to be seen to leave a mark. "Back," I said, "now." We turned and started down the ridge, retracing our route toward the plain. The wind hit our backs, pushing us like a warning. Halfway down, my pack strap shifted, and I heard a faint scrape, plastic against plastic. I looked down and realized the battery pack for my radio was still in my hand. In the rush, I'd never put it away. That's when the radio spoke again. Not from the radio, because the battery was out. From my pack. A thin metallic whisper coming from the satellite phone case strapped to the side. Marla heard it too. Her eyes snapped to mine. "No," she said, barely audible. The whisper formed a shape that made my stomach roll. It sounded like my own voice, but delayed, stretched, as if something had recorded me speaking and was replaying it wrong. "We follow." It was my words from earlier. I yanked open the case and pulled the satellite phone out. The screen was dark, no power. I held it to my ear anyway, like an idiot, static. Then a faint laugh, too soft to be human laughter, too dry, like air rubbing over bone. Ivo grabbed my arm. His grip was hard enough to hurt. "No, listen," he said. "No answer. Go." We moved. The plane stretched ahead, heat rippling above it now. Our water was down. The sun was higher than it had any right to be. The footprints, the handprints, the words, those were behind us. But the feeling of being observed didn't fade. It tightened. We walked in silence, saving breath. Every few minutes I looked back, expecting to see something crest the ridge. Nothing. And that was worse. After an hour, the wind changed direction. It came from the basin now, carrying that same acrid smell, sun-baked fabric, or perhaps something older, like old paper left in heat. Marla's pace slowed. She stumbled once, caught herself. Her lips were cracked. "We need shade," she said. "There isn't any," I replied, and hated myself for it. We spotted a cluster of tall boulders ahead, their shadows thin but better than nothing. We angled toward them. The rocks were dark, almost black, and radiated heat like a stove. We collapsed into the narrow strip of shade between two stones. I rationed water. 1 sip each, not enough to satisfy, but enough to keep the body from giving up. Marla stared at the open plain with a blank expression that scared me more than her fear. "What if that person—" she began, then stopped. "What if they didn't disappear?" I said quietly, finishing the thought she couldn't. "What if they were taken?" Ivo spoke without looking at us. "Land here is wrong," he said. "Old stories. People vanish. Tracks end. Sky takes them." "Sky?" Marla repeated. "Like abducted?" Ivo shrugged, but his eyes didn't laugh at the idea. "Not aliens," he said slowly, choosing words. "Not like movie. More like, the place is hungry." I wanted to dismiss it, but the evidence was sitting in my mind like a stone, a set of barefoot prints, a sudden stop. Handprints like crawling, a word in dust, a new word added while we watched, voices without power. The place was doing something. The question was why. I pulled out my notebook and flipped to the page where I'd written the coordinates, the ridge, the basin, the last print. I traced the line of our route with my pencil. "What if we're inside something?" I said, not because I believed it fully, but because my brain needed to build a model, like a pocket of terrain that behaves differently, magnetic anomalies, sound distortion, hallucination. Marla stared at me. "Ethan, the dust wrote a new word." I had no answer. We rested 10 minutes, then got up. Heat punished us immediately. The air shimmered, and the world beyond 20 yards blurred. We oriented toward the creek bed, toward our earlier path. That was when Ivo stopped again. He pointed at the ground, at a patch of dust between rocks. Footprints. Not the ones we'd followed. These were ours. 3 sets, clear enough to recognize. My boots. Marla's tread. Ivo's flat-soled trail shoes. But the direction was wrong. The prints pointed toward the basin, as if we had walked from the rocks to the basin, without remembering. Marla stared at them, confused. "That's impossible," she said. I looked at our position relative to the rocks and the sun, my compass, the line we'd chosen. The prints didn't lie. They were fresh. Fresh enough that the wind hadn't softened them. My mind tried to skip over it, but it wouldn't. "We didn't make those," I said, and the words tasted like fear. Ivo's jaw tightened. "Something copies," he said. The clicking returned. Closer now, from behind the boulders, as if something had moved while we rested. 3 taps. Pause. 2 taps. Marla backed up until her shoulder hit the rock. "Stop!" she whispered, not to us, but to the sound. I felt the primitive urge to shout into the empty plain, to demand answers. But Ivo's earlier warning echoed, "No listen, no answer." Instead, I did something worse. I pulled out the recorder from my pack, a small handheld audio device we used for field notes. I hadn't used it since the morning. My finger hovered over the record button. Marla's eyes widened. "What are you doing?" "If this place is using sound," I said, voice low, "then maybe we can catch what it's doing. Maybe we can understand." I hit record. At first, the recorder picked up only wind and our breathing. Then, faintly beneath it, the clicking rhythm. Ivo's hand shot out and tried to grab the recorder, but I pulled it back instinctively. "Bad," he said, angry now. "You feed it." "What if the only way out is to know what it wants?" I snapped back, then regretted it immediately. Because the moment my voice rose, the clicking stopped, and in the sudden gap, something else filled the air. A low tone, not a roar, not a howl, more like a vibration that settled into the bones. It came from everywhere at once, as if the basin itself had become a speaker. Marla clapped her hands over her ears and sank to her knees. Her face contorted with pain. Ivo swore under his breath in his own language and backed away, eyes wide. The recorder's little screen jumped, the audio level spiking into red. I tried to stop recording, but my finger felt clumsy, like my hand didn't belong to me. The tone thickened, pressing down on my chest, making breathing feel like pushing air through water. Then, through that tone, a voice formed. Not a clear voice. A chorus of half-voices layered over each other, like multiple recordings playing at once. "Stay. Stay. Stay." It wasn't speaking to our ears. It was speaking inside our heads. Marla sobbed. "Make it stop!" I ripped the batteries from the recorder. The tone didn't stop immediately. It lingered, vibrating for a few seconds longer, then snapped off like a cord being cut. Silence slammed down so hard it felt physical. We stayed frozen, breathing hard, hearts pounding. The wind returned, almost normal again. Ivo stared at me with something close to hatred. "You call it," he said. "Now it knows you." Marla looked up, tears streaking dust down her cheeks. What did it mean by stay? I didn't answer because the answer was a thought I didn't want to have. It wasn't telling us to stay in one spot. It was telling us we were already inside something, and it wanted us to accept it. We forced ourselves to move again, leaving the boulders behind. Every step felt watched. The sun hammered down. My mouth tasted like copper. We reached the creek bed after another brutal stretch. The pale dust that had held the first prints lay ahead like a page waiting for ink. Marla exhaled in relief when she saw it. "Good," she said. "We can follow our route back." Ivo didn't share her relief. He walked to the edge of the creek bed and stared down, his expression tightening. "What?" I asked, already dreading the answer. He pointed. The creek bed was covered in footprints. Hundreds of them. Barefoot prints, identical to the first ones we'd followed, stamped into the pale dust in every direction, circling, overlapping, forming spirals that made no sense. And mixed among them, fresh and unmistakable, were 3 sets of boot prints. Ours. But they weren't leading back the way we came. They were leading deeper into the creek bed, toward a bend we hadn't reached before, toward a narrow slot between rock walls that looked, from where we stood, like a mouth. Marla's voice came out as a whimper. "We didn't go there." I felt my legs go weak, because the boot prints didn't just look like ours. They matched our stride lengths exactly, as if someone had walked in our bodies, wearing our fear like a coat, and taken our steps for us. And from the dark bend ahead, carried on a wind that suddenly felt colder, came that clicking rhythm again. 3 taps, pause, 2 taps, like an invitation. Or a countdown. The creek bed should have been our lifeline. A shallow corridor of softer ground, a place where tracks make sense and direction is readable. But what waited below was not a trail, it was an argument. Bare footprints everywhere, stamped into the pale dust in a frantic geometry. Circles within circles, spirals that tightened like a noose, lines that began confidently and then broke into chaos. It looked less like someone walking and more like something practicing the idea of walking until it got it wrong on purpose. And threaded through it, clean, recent, brutally familiar, were 3 sets of bootprints, ours. Marla stared as if her eyes refused to translate what they were seeing. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. The heat had dried her voice, or fear had. Ivo stepped down first, careful and controlled, as if the creek bed were a sheet of thin ice. He hovered above the nearest bootprint and compared it to the sole of his own shoe. Then he looked at mine, then at Marla's. Same, he said. Same weight, same step. I forced myself to descend, placing my boots on stone edges to avoid adding new evidence. My mind tried to rescue me with the last scraps of logic. Maybe we had been here earlier without realizing. Maybe we had looped in the heat and delirium. But even that didn't work, because the bootprints led toward a bend I was certain we hadn't reached. They led toward the narrow slot between rock walls. From above, it had looked like a mouth. Now at ground level, it looked like a wound in the earth, dark and tight. The rock on either side worn smooth as if countless hands had polished it. The air coming out of it felt cooler than the rest of the basin, and it carried that same acrid scent. Dry cloth left too long in sun, mixed with something faintly metallic. Marla found her voice at last. "We didn't go there," she said, and it sounded like she was pleading with the dirt itself. Ivo didn't look at her. His eyes stayed fixed on the bend. "Footprints want you to go," he said, "so you do not." The clicking rhythm came again, so faint I could have mistaken it for stone shifting under wind. 3 taps, pause, 2 taps. It came from the slot, not from the air, from inside. I swallowed and tasted salt and dust. "We backtrack," I said. "We go wide. We get out of the creek bed. We head for the cache, then the extraction point." Marla nodded too fast, grateful for instructions. Ivo nodded once, but he was still listening the way a man listens for the first snap of a predator in tall grass. We turned away from the slot and followed the creek bed back in the direction we believed we'd come from. The problem was immediate. The bootprints braided and overlapped. Our trail, if it was ours, had been stepped over by those barefoot spirals so many times it was like trying to read a sentence that someone had scribbled over in anger. I found a point where the creek bed narrowed and the dust was thicker. There the tracks were clearer. I saw my own tread pattern, a small chip in the left sole that I'd noticed months ago, printed sharply into dust. It led forward, then another, then another. I felt a thin strand of relief, and that was my first mistake, because the bootprints didn't lead out. They led deeper, not toward safety, toward the bend, toward that dark slot that watched us without eyes. Marla saw it too and stumbled back, as if the dirt had bitten her. "No," she whispered. That's not us." Ivo crouched and pressed 2 fingers into the dust beside the bootprint. "Fresh," he said. "Newer than our steps today." "How can it be newer?" Marla asked, voice cracking. "We're standing right here. We've been together the whole time." I didn't answer. I was staring at the spaces between footprints, searching for anything human. Drag marks, a stumble, a hesitation. There was none. Whoever made these prints walked with our bodies and none of our doubt. The clicking came again, a little closer, as if the slot had leaned forward to hear our breathing. I made a decision that felt like tearing cloth. "We leave the creek bed," I said. "Now, we go up onto rock. The dust is its canvas. We don't give it canvas." We climbed out onto the rocky edge, using hands and careful foot placements. The rock was hot enough to sting through gloves. When we reached the top, The wind hit us full in the face, and for a moment the open plain looked merciful. Then Marla pointed down. At the base of the rock, below where we'd climbed, a new line of barefoot prints had formed. Perfect, identical stamps that led parallel to us, matching our direction from below, keeping pace. They were not chasing, they were escorting. Marla's breath hitched. "It's following us." Ivo stared at the new prints with a calm that wasn't calm at all. "It learns," he said. "It copies, it waits." I looked at the plain ahead. We could angle away from the creek bed and cut across harder ground toward our water cache, but the terrain was open. If something wanted us, there would be nowhere to hide. Still, staying near the slot felt worse than any open risk. We moved. Minutes passed with the kind of tension that makes time feel thick. Our boots crunched on gravel and stone, while below us in the creek bed, the bear prints continued, appearing in patches of dust where dust existed, disappearing over rock where it didn't. Always keeping pace, always neat, always calm. I tried not to look down, but the human brain is cruel. It turns toward the thing you fear like a magnet. The prints began to change again, not in shape, in spacing. At first, they matched a normal stride. Then gradually, the steps grew longer, impossibly longer, like whatever made them was stretching, learning to cover more ground with less effort. Marla noticed and made a small sound in her throat. "That's not human," she said. Ivo's eyes narrowed. "Not human," he agreed, "but wants to be." The heat got worse. The air shimmered. My tongue felt like leather. We rationed water in tiny mouthfuls, enough to wet the throat, but not enough to satisfy. The body began to complain in whispers, cramps in calves, a dull headache behind the eyes, the faint dizziness of dehydration. That's when we saw it. Far ahead on the open plain, something stood upright. At first it was only a vertical interruption in the horizon, too thin to be a boulder, too straight to be a shrub. Then it moved, and my stomach dropped. It was shaped like a person. Not a clear person, not detailed. More like the idea of a person at a distance, a silhouette that didn't quite fit the light. It stood facing us, motionless, as if it had been waiting in the exact spot our path would intersect. Marla stopped dead. Her hand went to her camera without thinking, then froze. "Is that someone?" she whispered. Ivo did not stop. He grabbed her elbow and pulled gently but firmly. "No look," he said. "No film, no call." I forced myself to walk, eyes forward, but the silhouette held my attention like a hook under the skin. It didn't wave. It didn't run. It simply existed, and existence was enough. As we got closer, the shape sharpened slightly, and I realized what was wrong. The figure's proportions were off. Its arms were too long. Its head sat too high on its shoulders. Its stance was almost human, but not balanced the way a real body balances, like something had arranged bones without living in them. Marla's voice trembled. "Ethan, it's standing where the footprints are going." I looked down the slope toward the creek bed. The bear prints below had angled toward the same point. The escort had become a guide. The clicking rhythm came again. 3 taps, pause, 2 taps. It came from the figure, not from a device, not from rock, from the air around it, as if the sound were the only part of it that was fully real. My mouth went dry despite the water. I raised my hand slightly, palm down, a silent signal to slow, to stay together. We did. The figure turned its head, not smoothly, not like a person, like a hinge finding its range. And then it spoke, not out loud. Inside my skull, behind my eyes, in that private space where thoughts are supposed to be safe, a voice formed. It used the shape of my own voice, but it wasn't mine. "Ethan!" Marla gasped beside me. Her eyes widened. "It said your name," she whispered. I heard it too. Ivo's face tightened, as if he'd been struck. He spat into the dust, a protective gesture, then muttered something under his breath. The figure took 1 step forward. Its foot hit a patch of dust, and a perfect barefoot print appeared beneath it, crisp, stamped, unquestionable. It lifted its foot again, and the dust did not crumble like it should. The print held as if pressed into clay. Marla backed up. Her heels slipped on gravel, and she caught herself with a sharp inhale. The figure stopped. Its head tilted again. That hinge movement, that wrongness. Then the voice returned inside my head, layered now with something else, like multiple recordings of me speaking over one another. Stay with us. I felt the urge to answer rise in my throat like a reflex. Humans answer when called. It's hardwired. But Evo's earlier warning slammed into me. No answer, no feed. So I did the only thing left. I ran, not blindly, controlled, forward, calling to Marla and Ivo to move with me. We sprinted across rock and gravel, lungs burning, heat clawing at the back of the throat. Behind us, I heard no footsteps, no pursuit. And that terrified me more than pursuit ever could. We reached a low shelf of rock where the ground dropped into a shallow ravine. It wasn't much, but it was a break in line of sight. We slid down into it, crouched low, and forced ourselves to breathe quietly. Marla's hands shook so badly she could barely open her water bottle. I steadied it for her, then took my own careful sip. Ivo pressed his ear to the rock wall like he was listening for the heartbeat of the earth. Minutes passed. Nothing. No clicking. No voice. No silhouette. Only wind above the ravine, and our ragged breathing slowly easing. Marla whispered, "Maybe it can't follow if we don't look." I wanted to believe that. I wanted to believe we had rules we could exploit. But the dust words had changed without our eyes on them. The voices had come through dead devices. This wasn't about sight, it was about attention. "We keep moving," I said. "We don't stop again unless we have shade or water." We climbed out of the ravine and pushed on. The cache was still hours away, and every step was now paid for with water we didn't have. The sun began to tilt, not dramatically, but enough that shadows lengthened. The heat eased slightly, replaced by a dry chill that hinted at how cold this place would become after dark. That's when the first real mistake happened. Marla tripped, not on rock, not on scrub, on nothing. Her foot snagged in open air and she pitched forward. I caught her by the packstrap just in time. She yelped, more from shock than pain. "What did you hit?" I asked. She looked down, confused. "I don't know." I crouched and ran my fingers over the ground where she'd stumbled. The surface looked like hardpan, flat, dusty, cracked. But under my glove it felt different, slightly spongy, as if the earth beneath the crust had been hollowed. Ivo stepped closer, eyes narrowing. He tapped the ground with the butt of his trekking pole. The sound that came back was wrong, not a dull thud, a hollow knock. Ivo's face changed. "No," he said, and I heard real alarm now. He tapped again, a little harder, hollow. He stepped back quickly, gesturing us away. "Sink," he said. "Thin ground." Marla's eyes widened. "A sinkhole." "Not hole," Ivo corrected. "Layer, like crust." I stood, heart pounding. In open desert, a hidden collapse can swallow a person whole. But this ground wasn't cracked enough, not visibly unstable. It was like the earth had been engineered to look safe. We moved around the spot in a wide arc, keeping to rockier patches. My mouth stayed tight with fear, because if the land could imitate our tracks and our voices, it could imitate safety too. The clicking returned, not behind us, below us. From beneath the hardpan, 3 taps, pause, 2 taps. Marla clapped a hand over her mouth to keep from screaming. Ivo backed away so fast he nearly fell. He steadied himself, eyes locked on the ground like it was about to open. Then the voice came again, inside my head, inside Marla's. I could tell by her expression, even inside Ivo's, because his lips parted in shock. "Stay." One word, heavy and intimate, as if it had been spoken right against the inside of my ear. The ground under my boots vibrated, subtle but undeniable. A faint tremor that traveled up through my ankles and into my knees. Dust in small cracks quivered. I forced myself to move, pulling Marla with me, gesturing Ivo to follow. We hurried across a stretch of rock that seemed more solid. The vibrations followed, then faded. We didn't stop until we reached a jagged outcrop that offered a small, cave-like indentation. Just enough shade to rest without touching questionable ground. We collapsed inside, backs against rock, and for the first time in hours, I let myself think clearly. We were being guided. The bear prints had escorted us. The silhouette had waited where the prints led. The unstable ground, was it a trap, a boundary, a funnel, and why the word stay? Marla looked at me, eyes red, dust-caked but sharp. "This is going to sound insane," she said, "but what if it's not trying to kill us?" I stared at her. What else would it be trying to do? She swallowed. "What if it's trying to keep us, like a place that collects people, keeps them inside it?" Ivo spoke quietly, almost to himself. "Stories say the same. People go in. Land remembers them, makes their steps." I felt cold creep under my ribs, not from temperature, but from implication. If the land remembered people, then the voices we heard might not be ours alone. I pulled out my notebook again, then hesitated. Writing felt dangerous now, like any act of recording was a form of permission. But if we were going to survive, we needed strategy. "We have two choices," I said. "We push for the cache before dark, or we shelter here and move at first light." Marla's face tightened. "If we stop, it gets closer." Ivo nodded. "If stop, it rights you." My stomach clenched. "Then we push," I said. We left the outcrop and moved with grim discipline, pacing ourselves, checking ground, sipping water like medicine. The sky began to darken into late afternoon, colors flattening. Shadows grew long and sharp. Then we saw the cache marker, a strip of reflective tape tied to a stone cairn, something we'd placed days earlier. It glinted faintly in the slanting sun, a small human signal in an indifferent world. Relief hit me so hard my knees weakened. Marla actually laughed once, a short broken sound, then immediately looked ashamed of it. We reached the cairn. I dropped to my knees and dug where the water container should have been buried beneath a flat stone. My gloves hit dust, then rock, then nothing. I dug faster, hands moving with panic. I pulled away stones, scraped dust until my nails ached. The container wasn't there. In its place, pressed into the dust like a signature, was a perfect bare footprint, and beside it, drawn carefully, as if with a patient finger, was a sentence that made my blood run cold. "You left it here for us." I looked up, mouth open, and saw that the reflective tape on the cairn wasn't fluttering in wind. It was being held between two long fingers that were not quite human, and from just beyond the cairn, hidden by the angle of rock, something leaned forward as if stepping into our world, wearing the stretched silhouette of a person it had practiced becoming. Chapter 4 was suddenly not a next step. It was the only step left. The first thing my brain tried to do was deny what my eyes were offering. It wasn't a person. It couldn't be. The heat, dehydration, and exhaustion had all worked on us like slow poison. Hallucinations weren't just possible, they were predictable. But hallucinations don't hold reflective tape between fingers. The tape was stretched taut, pinched delicately between two elongated digits. The hand was the color of dust after rain, pale, matte, neither skin nor stone. Where fingernails should have been, there were smooth ends, as if the hand had been unfinished. Marla made a sound that wasn't a scream, because her throat couldn't produce one. It was a dry, broken exhale, the sound of a person trying to hold herself together and failing. Ivo didn't move. He stood rigid, like a man facing a cliff edge in fog. The thing behind the cairn leaned a fraction farther out. The silhouette had learned more since we last saw it. The head sat lower, the shoulders looked almost right, and the arms, still too long, hung with a false patience. It wasn't walking toward us in a rush. It didn't need to. It believed we were already where it wanted us. Inside my skull, the voice returned, My voice stitched together from old recordings of me speaking in other places, other times. A patchwork of my tone with something colder underneath. You left it here. The words didn't arrive through my ears. They arrived as pressure, as if someone pushed them into the soft tissue behind my eyes. Marla whispered, "Ethan, don't answer." Her hand found my sleeve and gripped like it was the only stable object left in the universe. Ivo did something I hadn't seen him do before. He drew a small knife from his belt, not a weapon for fighting, a tool, and held it down by his thigh. His posture didn't say attack. It said readiness to cut something away. The thing's fingers tightened on the tape. The tape didn't flutter. No wind disturbed it. The air around the creature felt oddly still, like a bubble of calm inside a storm. I forced my lungs to work. "We take the long way," I said softly, not to it, only to Marla and Ivo. "We don't approach. We don't look at it longer than we have to. We move." But as I spoke, I felt a dangerous shift in the air. A slight thickening, like humidity that didn't belong. The creature's head turned with that hinge motion, and the voice inside me sharpened. "Ethan." Marla flinched, as if she'd been slapped. I saw it now. She was hearing it too, not just the sound, but the intimacy of it. The voice didn't just call my name. It placed itself between our thoughts. I took a step back carefully. The ground under my boots felt solid, but after the hollow knock, I trusted nothing. The thing stepped out from behind the cairn. It was taller than it had appeared at a distance, over 7 feet, maybe more. It stood with a posture that tried to be human, weight distributed, shoulders relaxed, but the proportions betrayed it. The torso was too long, the legs were too straight. The joints moved with a slight delay, like a puppet learning the timing of gravity. Its feet touched dust, and 2 bare prints appeared with perfect clarity. The prints were identical to the first ones we'd followed. Same size, same impossible sharpness. It lowered the tape slowly and tied it back to the stone cairn, as if demonstrating manners. Then it raised one hand and held it palm up between us. Not a threat, an invitation. In the pale center of its palm lay something small and dark. At first I thought it was a pebble. Then sunlight hit it and I saw plastic, a battery pack, my radio battery pack, the same one I'd removed and carried in my hand. My stomach dropped so hard I thought I'd vomit. Marla shook her head violently. "No, no, no, no." Ivo's voice came out like gravel. "It takes," he said. "It returns. It wants trade." The creature's head tilted. It rotated its wrist, letting the battery pack roll slightly in its palm. Then it closed its fingers around it with delicate control. Inside my head, the voice became almost gentle. My voice softened, a tone I used when calming frightened interviewees, when reassuring crews. "Stay, and we give back." Marla choked on a sob. "Give back who?" she whispered. The creature didn't answer directly. It didn't need to. It stepped sideways and pointed, one long finger extending toward the open plain behind it. At first I saw only heat shimmer and distant rock. Then my eyes focused, and I saw something that turned my blood to ice. A line of figures, far away near the horizon, standing still, human-shaped silhouettes, dozens of them spaced evenly like markers, some tall, some short, some slumped, some upright, all motionless. Marla's knees buckled. I grabbed her harness and held her up. "Those aren't—" she began and couldn't finish. Ivo stared without blinking. His knife lowered an inch, forgotten. The voice inside my head pressed again. "Stay." I closed my eyes for 1 second, trying to force my brain into clarity. Survival is math. Resources, distance, terrain, time. We had lost the cache water. That meant our margin was gone. The extraction point was still far, too far without water, unless we found another cache, or the terrain offered an alternative. And now there was this thing, this imitation, offering a trade we didn't understand. We couldn't fight it. Not with a knife, not with hands, not with reason. The only leverage we had was refusal, but refusal meant crossing open ground with limited water. I opened my eyes and looked at Marla. She was trembling, lips blue at the edges, eyes wide and wet. Ivo looked like a man who had already decided this place wasn't meant to be beaten, only escaped. I made the decision in a voice I barely recognized as mine. "We don't stay," I said. "We move now. We do not accept anything. We do not take what it offers." The creature's head turned toward me slowly, almost disappointed. And the clicking rhythm started again. 3 taps, pause, 2 taps, faster this time. Marla clamped her hands over her ears, but that didn't help. The sound wasn't in the air, it was in the bones. Ivo grabbed Marla's other arm. "Run," he said, the first time he'd used that word all day. We ran, not straight across the plain. That would have been suicide. We ran along the line of rock shelves, where the ground was more stable, where footing existed. Gravel sprayed under our boots. Our packs bounced, breath burned in our throats like sand. Behind us, I heard nothing at first. No pursuit. Then the voice came again inside my head, louder, layered with a second voice. Marla's voice now, sampled and warped. Her tone flattened into something unnatural. "Ethan, we should stay," Marla gasped. "That's me," she cried. "It's using me." I forced myself not to look back. Looking back felt like consent. The wind shifted, suddenly cold. The sky, which had been clear, took on a faint haze. Dust lifted in the distance, forming a low wall. A sandstorm. Not a gentle one, not a distant veil. A fast-moving front that rose from the direction of the basin, like a curtain being yanked shut. Ivo saw it and cursed. "Storm comes," he said. "It pushes you to it." Marla's breathing turned ragged. "We can't outrun that." "We don't have to outrun it," I said, scanning desperately. "We need cover, anything." Ahead, a cluster of dark rocks rose like broken teeth. Between them, a narrow gap, tight enough to block wind, deep enough to shelter. We sprinted for it. The air darkened. Dust began to sting our faces. The storm's leading edge hit us like a slap. We dove into the gap between rocks, just as the wind became a roaring wall. Inside the crevice, the sound of the storm turned into a deep howl, like a giant exhaling through a tunnel. Dust swirled at the entrance but didn't reach far inside. We pressed into the stone, bodies cramped, hearts hammering. Marla sobbed silently, trying not to make noise. Ivo braced his boots and kept his knife ready, though I didn't know what he thought it could do. The storm raged outside, turning the world invisible. And that's when the creature came. Not with footsteps, with sound. The clicking rhythm appeared at the mouth of the crevice, perfectly audible through the roar of the storm. 3 taps, pause, 2 taps. Then a shadow blocked the thin light at the entrance. A shape leaned in. Marla squeezed my arm so hard my fingers went numb. Ivo lifted his knife, not to stab, just to have something in his hand that said, "I'm still human." The creature's head appeared, angled too far, peering into the crevice like a child looking into a burrow. Its face was not a face. Smooth planes where features should have been, and in the center a shallow indentation that suggested a mouth without being one. Inside my mind, the voice became intimate, soft, safe. Here, I realized the horror of it. The storm was real. The shelter was real. The creature had not created the danger. It had used it. It was teaching us that safety came through it. Marla, shaking, whispered, "It's trying to train us." Ivo's eyes stayed locked on the creature. "Like dog," he muttered. "Reward. Punish." The creature extended its arm into the crevice, palm up. This time it held something else. A piece of fabric, weathered, sun-bleached, a small strip of cloth with a stitched edge, like part of a shirt sleeve. And on it, faint but legible, was a printed logo from an outfitter brand used by expeditions, not ours. Someone else's. My throat tightened. We weren't the first. The voice pressed again. Stay, and we return. More. Marla's eyes went to the cloth and filled with fresh tears. That's proof, she whispered. That's proof someone was taken. I wanted to reach for it. The part of me that needed answers surged forward, but Ivo shook his head violently and his expression was pure warning. I forced my hands to stay at my sides. The creature waited, arms still, patient as stone. Outside, the storm screamed. The sky had become a moving wall. We were trapped in a narrow throat of rock, with a thing offering proof like bait. My mind raced. If we stayed here until the storm passed, we risked the creature escalating, moving closer, blocking the exit, forcing contact. If we ran into the storm, we risked disorientation, injury, death. Ivo leaned close to my ear, barely moving his lips. When storm is loud, he whispered, it cannot hear you well. We go now. It was insane. It was also the only advantage we'd had all day. I nodded once. Then I looked at Marla. She understood without words. Her eyes squeezed shut and she nodded too. We moved as one. Ivo stepped first, slashing his knife outward, not to cut the creature, but to claim space. The creature's arm withdrew slightly, not startled, but cautious. In that fraction of a second, we lunged past it into the storm. The wind hit like a physical force. Dust filled my mouth, my nose, my eyes. I pulled my scarf up, but it was useless. Visibility dropped to arm's length. The world became noise and grit and directionless pressure. I grabbed Marla's pack strap to keep from losing her. Ivo stayed on my other side, one hand on my elbow. We moved by instinct and compass. I held the compass close, shielding it from wind, trying to keep a straight bearing away from the basin and away from the slot. Every few steps, I checked it again. The needle wobbled strangely, dipping and pulling, magnetic interference or my shaking hands. I couldn't tell. The storm swallowed time. Minutes felt like hours. Then, through the grit, I heard the clicking rhythm again, close, as if it had followed us into the storm, without needing sight. Marla made a strangled sound. It's here! I tightened my grip on her strap. Keep moving, I shouted, though my voice was shredded by wind. The clicking grew faster, turning into something like laughter. Then the voice, this time not inside my head, but in the air, carried on the wind like a warped broadcast. Ethan, this way. Ahead, through the dust, I saw a darker shape, a ridge maybe, or a wall of rock. My mind screamed to head for it, for shelter. But then I saw it. A patch of pale ground beyond, the creek bed dust, the perfect canvas. The voice was guiding us back toward the slot. I stopped so abruptly, Marla collided into me. Ivo stumbled. We're being turned, I shouted. It's steering us. The compass needle spun, not a wobble, a full spin like it had lost north entirely. Panic surged. This was how people vanish, by losing the one thing that tells you where you are when the world disappears. Then I felt something under my boot, a change in texture, hard pan becoming spongy, the hollow ground again. I yanked my foot back, but the crust beneath us trembled. A crack split under Marla's boot. She screamed, and the sound was ripped away by wind. The ground gave, not a dramatic collapse, just a sudden sinking, like a trapdoor releasing. I grabbed Marla and threw my weight backward, dragging her toward rock. Ivo grabbed both of us, pulling with a strength born of terror. The crust fell away where we'd stood, dust and stones dropping into darkness with no sound of impact. A pit, deep. The storm churned above it, and the edges crumbled like dry cake. We scrambled onto a narrow shelf of rock, hearts hammering. Marla clung to me, sobbing. Ivo stared into the pit, and his face tightened. "This is mouth," he said. And then, from the darkness below the pit, the clicking rhythm echoed upward. 3 taps, pause, 2 taps, slow and satisfied. The storm began to ease, as if its purpose had been served. Dust thinned, light returned in weak strips. And in that clearing air, just beyond the pit, I saw the footprints again, bare, perfect, circling the hole like a border. We were standing on the edge of the place's throat, and it had almost swallowed us. Marla's voice was hoarse. "What do we do now?" I looked around, eyes stinging, and spotted something that didn't belong. A line of stacked stones, a crude cairn, half buried by dust. Too deliberate to be natural. Human. Hope. We staggered toward it, keeping to rock, avoiding dust patches like they were mines. At the cairn, wedged between stones, was a metal tube sealed with wax, an old-fashioned emergency cache, different from ours, older, more desperate. I tore it open with shaking hands. Inside was a folded sheet of paper, plastic-wrapped, and a small, half-full water pouch that looked like it had been there for years, but somehow hadn't evaporated. I drank one mouthful, then handed it to Marla. She drank, eyes wide with disbelief. Ivo took a small sip last, disciplined. I unfolded the paper. The handwriting was shaky and cramped, lines slanting downward, written by someone who was running out of strength. The message was short. "Don't answer it. Don't follow the prince. The place learns your voice. If you hear your name, you're already inside. The only exit is the stone line at dusk. Walk it without speaking. Don't look back." Below that, a final line. "If you fail, leave this note for the next ones." My hands trembled so violently the paper crackled. Marla stared at the words, then up at the horizon where the sun was lowering. "The stone line at dusk," she whispered. "What is that?" I scanned the landscape and saw, far away, a faint row of darker rocks, stretching like a seam across the plain. Too straight to be random. A line, a boundary, or an exit. Ivo nodded slowly, eyes fixed on it like a starving man seeing food. "Old marker," he said. "Yes, people know. Few live." We didn't have time. Dusk was coming fast, the light turning amber, the shadows lengthening. If the note was true, we had one chance and one rule. Walk the stone line, without speaking, without looking back. We started toward it immediately, moving as fast as we could without stepping onto dust. The air cooled. The world grew quiet again, that arranged quiet that made every sound feel like a betrayal. As we approached the stone line, the clicking rhythm began one last time behind us. Steady, patient. 3 taps, pause, 2 taps. It was following. The voice slid into my head softer than ever, almost tender. "Ethan, you don't have to leave." I clenched my jaw so hard it ached. I wanted to scream. I wanted to cry. I wanted to answer just to end the pressure, but I didn't. We reached the first stone of the line, just as the sun kissed the horizon. The rocks formed a narrow path, like stepping stones across invisible water. On either side of the line, the ground looked the same, dust and hardpan. But the note insisted this was the only way out. I stepped onto the first stone. Marla followed, eyes locked on my back. Ivo brought up the rear, knife gone now, replaced by pure focus. We walked stone to stone, careful, silent. The rule was a rope we held with both hands. Halfway across I heard it, my own voice behind me, not inside my head, behind me in the air, perfectly imitated. "Ethan." Wait. It was so real my muscles reacted before my mind, a reflex to turn, to check, to respond. Marla's breath hitched. I felt her almost stop. Ivo made a sharp gesture, his hand slicing forward like a command. "Don't." We kept walking. The voice changed. It became Marla's voice now, crying out with perfect desperation. "Ethan, please." I tasted blood where I'd bitten my tongue. Tears burned my eyes, but I didn't blink, didn't look back. The clicking sped up, becoming frantic, then angry. The air around us thickened like pressure before a storm. The stones under my boots grew colder with each step, as if the line existed in a different temperature than the world around it. Then, near the end, the rocks became slick, as if coated in fine dust. My boot slipped. I windmilled my arms to balance, heart hammering. In that moment of weakness, the voice hit me with one last cruel attempt. My daughter's voice, a child's voice, clear as a bell, calling me from behind, with a tone that stabbed straight through instinct. "Dad?" My entire body locked, because that voice was not from this place. It was from my memory, and it was perfect. Marla made a strangled sound, and I knew she'd heard something different, something designed to split her open too. The world tilted. The stones beneath my boots felt suddenly far away, like I was walking above a drop. Ivo slammed his hand into my back, hard, not to hurt, but to push me forward. I stumbled onto the next stone, and the next, and the next. The voices behind us rose into a tangled chorus of stolen tones, desperate and furious. Then, without warning, the air changed. The pressure lifted, the coldness eased, the wind returned with a normal, indifferent sweep. We stepped off the last stone onto solid ground that felt ordinary. I turned my head slightly, not back, never back, but enough to sense that the horizon had shifted. The stone line behind us looked shorter than it should have, like the distance had folded. Marla fell to her knees and sobbed openly now, the kind of sobbing that comes when you realize you're still alive. Ivo stood still, eyes closed, lips moving silently in thanks or prayer. I stared at my hands, at the dust under my boots. No new footprints appeared. No perfect bear prints escorted us. No clicking. For the first time since we found the first footprint, the silence belonged to nature again. We walked for another hour until we found a rise with clear visibility. And there, in the fading light, we saw it, far behind us, the basin, the ridge. And near the horizon, a line of human-shaped silhouettes standing motionless, watching the place that kept them. One of the silhouettes lifted an arm slowly, like a wave. And even from that distance, I knew the proportions were wrong. Marla whispered, voice shaking, "It's still there." Ivo looked at me, face carved from exhaustion. "It always there," he said. "It waits for next." We didn't speak after that. Not for a long time. We just kept walking, chasing the last light, carrying the note like a curse and a gift. And later, weeks later, safe in a city where walls had corners and silence was optional, I listened to the recorder file I'd captured before tearing out the batteries. Most of it was wind. But at the very end, beneath my own voice arguing with Ivo, there was a second layer, so faint it almost wasn't there, a whisper in perfect, unbroken English. Not my voice, not Marla's. Something older. "Thank you for teaching me."